Welcome back, everybody, to this afternoon's special session of our workshop. It's a great pleasure, honor, and delight to have Daniel Kehlmann with us now, one of Germany's leading novelists, intellectuals, writers, and someone whose work, I mean, just the literary production is highly philosophical in all sorts of ways, but Daniel is also someone who actually engages with philosophy then as a theorist, thinker, writer, and intellectual. And we have a long-standing, ongoing conversation, among other things, on issues having to do with artificial intelligence. So Daniel published a couple of years ago, and it feels surprisingly old now, and that's something we're going to discuss, right? My Algorithm and Me, which was an experiment that he ran with software developers in California to see if the large language model they were using could relevantly produce literature together with him, and it failed in interesting ways, right? Yes. But it didn't keep up. But now, as we will be discussing, things have changed rapidly. So we'll look at some very fundamental issues, but also discuss the relationship between literature, meaning, value, and artificial intelligence. And we will seize the opportunity, and I'll start with that in a moment, to listen to a brand new podcast produced in California. Some of you might have heard the podcast, but anyhow, we'll get a sense of this amazing podcast. And they just did something on McNeil, a play written by Ayat Akhtar, who might join us in this afternoon if he finds the time. It's on Broadway now, premiered yesterday officially, right? With Robert Downey Jr. in the lead role, and it is about, well, let the podcast just tell us what it is about for just the first 3 or 4 minutes to warm up before we start discussing. So first listen.
Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we are going to do a deep dive into Ayat Akhtar's new play, McNeil.
Yes.
We were lucky enough to get early access to the production draft.
Very cool.
And this is one that I think we're both really excited to dig into. So McNeil, just to give everyone a little bit of background, this is about a Nobel Prize winning author who is kind of coming to terms with his legacy, with his mortality, and with some of the choices that he's made throughout his career. And, it's set against this backdrop of kind of technology and AI and all of these things that I think we're all kind of grappling with.
It's so relevant for our moment, right?
Totally, yeah.
It's like Akhtar tapped into the zeitgeist and pulled out this play that feels so immediate, so urgent.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that really struck me just from the opening scene is how Akhtar immediately plunges us into McNeil's world. We meet him at the doctor's office.
Right.
And he's just been given some, not so great news about his health.
Right from the start, you get this sense of mortality weighing on him.
Yes.
Which, for a writer, for someone obsessed with legacy, it's like a punch to the gut.
Totally. And the way McNeil deals with it, or rather doesn't deal with it, it's so classic McNeil, right? He deflects with humor, cracking jokes about playing golf with the doctor's father. But you can tell there's this underlying current of fear.
Absolutely. He's brilliant, he's charming, but he is terrified of what this diagnosis means.
And that's where the technology piece comes in, right?
Exactly. Akhtar doesn't shy away from how technology, especially AI, is woven into our anxieties about life and death. Remember that line where McNeil's like, let's check with Suarez, referring to the AI model tracking his liver.
Right. It's darkly funny.
Yeah.
But it also kind of sends shivers down your spine because it makes you think, are we surrendering our humanity to these algorithms?
Totally. McNeil's fear of AI, it's like a stand-in for a much bigger societal fear.
So that's a great start. And Daniel and I had the chance of interacting with the podcast host, and we sent them a little document, and they produced the following 3 minutes podcast for us, which will reveal the conditions.
Okay, so have you ever really gotten into a podcast, and then it suddenly hits you, what if this whole thing was written by AI?
Yeah.
Kind of makes you wonder, right? Can AI actually understand the stuff it's talking about, or is it just a really, really good mimic? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today with their KI podcast. They really go deep on this whole AI understanding thing.
It's a question a lot of people are asking these days. I mean, AI is everywhere, right? Cat podcast makes this point that a lot of the AI-generated stuff out there, like, it's technically amazing,
Right.
but it can feel kind of, I don't know, mechanical is the word they use.
Right.
Like, it's following the rules, but not really getting the deeper meaning.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's following a recipe, but doesn't actually get to taste the food.
Yeah.
And they talk about this thing called biological externalism. Sounds crazy complicated.
It does.
But it's a really interesting idea.
It is.
Basically, it's saying that, like, to really understand something, you have to experience it in the real world with, like, a physical body and senses and all that.
Yeah, like, think about cave paintings, right?
Okay.
They're full of meaning, but that meaning comes from the actual lived experiences of the people who made them, you know, their daily lives, their environment, everything. And AI, at least for now, it's just like lines of code. It doesn't have that connection to the physical world.
Right. So to really get it, AI needs to, like, escape the matrix and grow a body or something.
Huh. Well, it's not necessarily about needing a robot body, but it does make you wonder, how could AI ever understand what it's like to feel a raindrop or see a sunset? You know, those real-world experiences that shape how we understand things.
Wow. Okay, yeah. I never thought of it that way. It's like a whole different way of experiencing reality.
Totally.
And speaking of things that make you question reality, the piece also talked about AI-generated voices. Like, are those voices even real, or are they just super sophisticated imitations?
Right. It's getting harder and harder to tell the difference these days.
Seriously. So, like, how does AI even create a voice that sounds so human in the first place?
Well, it all comes down to patterns. AI analyzes massive amounts of data, in this case, recordings of human speech, and it learns to recognize the patterns in those recordings, like the way our voices rise and fall, the subtle pauses, all those little nuances. And then it uses those patterns to create new speech.
So it's all about recognizing and recreating patterns. But that makes me wonder, even if AI can sound like us, can it ever really understand the meaning behind the words?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Is AI just really, really good at mimicking human intelligence? Or is it developing its own kind of intelligence? And if so, what does that even mean?
Yeah, like, would we even recognize it if we saw it?
Exactly.
So where does this all leave us? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think Durkheim podcast really highlights that as AI keeps getting more advanced, we might need to start rethinking some pretty fundamental things, like what does it actually mean to be intelligent? What is consciousness? And how do we define reality in a world where AI can create such convincing simulations?
Whoa. Okay, that is a lot to process. So listeners, we want to hear from you. What do you think? Can AI truly understand, or is it all just really, really good mimicry? Let us know.
Okay, good. So some of you might have guessed. This is AI produced. We fed McNeil, the play, to the AI, just the document. And I wrote a very short document, half a page, this afternoon in German, about AI producing a podcast based on texts, with just a few points, the cave painting and so forth, just a bunch of words. And this is what the system produced. And it takes less than 2 minutes to produce it. I also have one just made, if you want, later, Hegel's Logic. It's amazing. I gave it the German Gesamtausgabe Hegel, and I listened to the encyclopedia this afternoon and the Science of Logic, and it has a very interesting reading of the syllogisms that goes significantly beyond the existing literature. So that's just on a side note. All of this, so you feed it text, and it doesn't just translate the text one-to-one. The lived experience, the raindrop, subjective experience bits, they were not in my text at all. I can share the text later with you. It's just, most of the examples. So it's not just voices reading the text in any way, right? So the McNeil podcast is 11 minutes. So they're all around 10 minutes typically. But here, I also have one on our seminar, which we can listen to. But yeah, they're easy to produce, highly recommended. So this is the starting point of today's conversation. So Daniel, what has changed since algorithm and me?
Yeah, everything. I mean, my experiment, or that experiment I was invited to take part in, that was in early 2020, before the pandemic, right before the pandemic, I think January or February. And back then there was no LLM publicly available. So it was very interesting and exciting for me because I wrote a sentence and then the LLM gave the next sentence. So that was the idea, and whether we could cooperate writing a story. It was still kind of amazing what it was able to do judging from the fact that I think most people had never seen anything like it. So it was pretty amazing, but also it really didn't work. Like also on a purely technical level, it didn't work. It usually froze after about a page or so. Or it went into some endless loop, or it just produced random nonsense after a while. It was kind of interesting, and I wrote a little. I wrote a talk. I did a talk about it 1 year later, and that talk was published as a little book, and sold a surprising amount of copies, I have to say, and people still buy it. I really wouldn't do that. And they want me to sign it, and I'm like, yeah, I will, but you do know that this is kind of worthless now, and people are like, why? And of course, we agreed. The publisher, I said to the publisher, let's not, when this is sold out, the current print run, let's not reprint it. And the publisher said, yeah, I get it. So, but the thing that's really amazing about that experience, about having written this talk and then having witnessed the whole revolution of generative AI that we all saw, is because I did that experiment in not very far past. I feel like I might have a little bit more of a sense than most people around me about how incredibly fast this thing evolved. What an unbelievable revolution it is that we are witnessing here. So no one can guarantee that AI will develop in the same speed. It might accelerate. It might also slow down. I think at this point, anything is possible. But if it accelerates at the same rate, I've seen it accelerate in the last 4 years, then I don't want to make predictions, but I'm just saying it's gonna be unbelievable I don't know whether that's a good or bad thing. I'm just maybe we can talk about that later, but it's going to be unbelievable what we are going to see. And then also, again, that's maybe the other thing that's interesting about this book of mine still being bought by people and read by people. And you will probably not often hear a writer say that. It's not something I'm in the habit of saying, but this book is worthless now. And people buy it and read it and they don't know it. And there's this term that's kind of thrown around a lot, situational awareness. And that makes me realize people really don't have situational awareness. They really don't see where we are right now.
How, like some of the questions that arise, of course, when it comes to, literary meaning, style, and such, right? The artistic quality of the work. So did you recently interact with AI systems in such a way that you would say what they produce has, a literary quality that goes beyond the podcast, right? Because the podcast has some literary quality, but the more you listen to it, that's why, I had it say it's mechanical, right? What it also did not figure out was that the document I wrote is about that, right? So the AI podcast what did not happen is that the podcast realized, those two voices, that the document they're reading is about that, right? So that did not happen. That would have been somewhat more shocking. But given what I heard earlier, for instance, it wouldn't have surprised me. What it, for instance, realized about Hegel's logic based on the text was that Hegel's logic is not about formulating laws of thought, but about the thinking that leads to the formulation of laws of thought. That's what it realized.
Wow.
Right? And that's quite remarkable. So I thought that, maybe it could realize that I wrote a text about it, which it didn't. And and some of the examples are pretty worn out, like it gets roughly the lived experience, subjective consciousness topics when it comes to AI. It also, we have to leave the matrix and get robot bodies bit. None of this was in my text, but that's also not yet, like great literature, or so it seems. But like, did you see anything that would, make you committed to a prediction according to which this will be capable of producing great literature?
I did not. I have to say, about 2 weeks ago, the first time like most writers, I regularly ask ChatGPT to write a story in my style, and because it's very interesting. And about 2 weeks ago, was the first time it offered me a story that was not terrible. Not just not terrible, it was not a great story, but I think if I had published that story, people would have believed it's mine. They would have shrugged and said, well, might not have been his best day, but well. So that's something. I think we are all, when we talk about AI, and I might be completely wrong here, but I think, and I don't mean us here, I mean society in general, we are too fixated on art and literature. And this is me going out on a limb here, but art and literature, literature is really about narrative literature, I mean, but also actually any literature. It's also true about poems, is also about producing the most unexpected turn in every situation. Always, or not the most, but an unexpected turn of events, an unexpected turn of phrase. So it's kind of per definition what large language models are not made for. Even if I know it's not true that it always produces the most likely phrase. There are these things that you guys probably know so much more about it than I, but there's this thing called weights where you manipulate the statistical probability a little bit, but it's still going for the most not the most unexpected turnout. So I think it might be a while, or maybe never, but I feel that's really not the most important question. When I heard this podcast, it's a new function offered by Google. It's called Notebook LM, and you can upload texts and then have them summed up, have a conversation about the texts, have like real questions, and that podcast is kind of a nice little way to get a summary. That's the idea, actually, why Google was offering this, because if you're bored by reading a summary of a long thing, that you're too bored to read the long thing, but you're also too bored to read the summary, so you can get the podcast, and it does give you a good idea of what's in there. And I think what we're getting now is, and actually I just did, on this thing, I uploaded all scripts I have ever written and all plays, and I uploaded half a screenplay I have, I'm working on right now, and I asked for suggestions. And they were not very good. There was nothing in there I could use, but they all made sense. They were just not very good, but they made sense. And I think quite a while ago, we talked about that often. We got to the point where AI can easily pass the Turing test. So the Turing test is over. Like it's been done.
I agree.
And I think now, especially with this notebook thing and the podcast and everything, we have reached a point where we cannot say it doesn't really understand things. This is understanding, and apparent, and we do it. I do not see how there can be any definition of what understanding means that excludes this podcast from having understood what it is talking about. And I think what's so interesting about AI is that, like many big achievements in human progress and development, it makes us realize things about ourselves. We learn things about how we think and what thinking is. And I would say we have just learned that understanding doesn't require consciousness. There is a way to understand that doesn't necessarily go with being conscious. And that's completely surprising to me, but it seems to be the case.
I mean, one can always push back against all of this. So let's see how far we think this could get us. I mean, the pushback strategy looks something, is always going to look, like this. There's something essential about our life form. We talked about survival this morning, but there's something essential about our life form as multicellular organisms or whatever it is about our life form, such that that thing is absent from AI, bodily fluids, right? But it has some similarity in some other relevant respect, information processing by way of filtering information from the electromagnetic spectrum. We do this, brains do this, organisms do this, AI does it. But the bit that seems to be just inessential might turn out to be essential, such that actually nothing has changed, right? So this is still a simulation of intelligence with 0 degree of intelligence. It's a simulation of understanding with 0 degree of understanding. I mean, that doesn't get us very far, but I think this might be the case. But,
and it's just a hypothesis.
Of course.
Again, I'm being very careful here because this is very new and we are all kind of in the dark when we try to think about it. But my answer to it would be there is something that Leibniz posited that's called the identity of the identitas indiscernibilium. That saying that two things which you cannot discern between are identical, and I feel like I cannot really see where. And again, it's not about consciousness. It's about understanding, where a human being understanding something, and Google AI, in this case it's Google, but it could also GPT AI, understanding something, how the results are profoundly different. I don't see that.
No, absolutely. It will be very, for one thing, if we draw a distinction between being good at something and doing that very thing, right? So then the arguments of the form, they're not very good at literature, they're not very good at Hegel interpretation.
Most people are not.
Exactly. For one thing, most people, this is,
most podcasts are really, you can say this is not an excellent podcast, but most podcasts are just like this.
I mean, that's the very point of it. The very point of it is that it's like most podcasts. And most people who understand anything understand less than that system, right? I mean, so it's much better at Hegel interpretation than 99% of humans. So that's, and there I'd be happy to say that, it turns out, and there's a sense in which this shouldn't have been surprising, given just the history of these systems. I mean, it all goes back to developments of logics from Leibniz to the 19th century, right? All of this is grounded. But I mean, Leibniz is at the beginning of all of this anyhow. And the history of logical discoveries basically is the history of understanding that there's a relationship between logics and semantics. And what we didn't know until fairly recently is that semantics, the fact that semantics has to be encoded in the universe, that got typically ignored by philosophers because, from Frege, and beyond even Turing, doesn't really think about, the physical requirements of encoding semantical information in the universe. Now, what happened then in the information revolution from the 50s onwards mostly was that we understood that there's an additional connection, not just between logics and semantics, which makes it possible in principle to model absolutely all, understanding by mechanizing it. It would have been surprising if this was not possible, right? I mean, the Frege Church thesis is a famous result from the philosophy of semantics, tells us that everything that is meaningful can in principle be modeled in some such way. I think the surprising thing was that it can be encoded. Now, I wonder, because you also talk to lots of, technology and science visionaries, what might happen with quantum computing. So are you expecting another acceleration, or, what's your sense?
I mean, I really feel like I'm not the right person to answer that. I really don't know. My sense is first that, you have actually more information about that than I do, but my sense is that quantum computing, it will be still a long way until quantum computers will be like this, like just like real world devices that we can use, and not some half real gigantic thing in a lab. But if we get this this explosion, this revolution of computing power, then of course it will have a huge effect. I mean, one thing that's kind of interesting, and again, this is not some arcane information. There was a big New York Times piece about this a few weeks ago. One thing that is happening is that the LLMs now kind of reach the end, and they reach not the end of the internet. There is always more, but there is more and more in the internet of content that was created by LLMs and generative AI, and there is a real danger that this will significantly degrade the power of AI systems, and actually then the answer to that is don't. And again, that's not me, that's what the experts say, is don't increase the databases, increase the computing power. And well, that's what they're all trying to do now. And I think it's the right question. With the quantum computer, it's kind of it's fascinating what's possible. I mean, maybe everybody in the media is always so sure that, they are not conscious. There's not going to be, consciousness is not going to be an issue of this. I don't know, why is everyone so sure? But if you have a quantum computer doing the same thing, who knows? I don't.
Yeah, let's delve into this, right? I mean, now I feel like I sounded like the guy from the podcast.
Right. Let's do a deep dive.
Yeah, let's do a deep dive. That is on consciousness. The question is, so I think what we've learned at the latest, like with this podcast, when he sent this to me, that's why I stopped reading. I was reading Omri Bohm's book on radical universalism, disagreeing with almost every page, but in interesting ways. Daniel has just written a book together also with Omri Bohm, a dialogue book on Kant. This just on a side note here, like a little new school reference. So I was reading his Radical Universalism, and then Daniel sent me a link to these podcasts, so I couldn't stop listening to them, introducing them, and so forth. And I do have to admit, it would strike me as outrageous if one still defended the view that this doesn't understand, right?
Yeah.
And then claiming, oh, this is pattern recognition. Doesn't do anything, because then the lesson will be understanding is pattern recognition.
I mean, that is another thing that I personally really learned from the LLMs is it's not just how well they generate language. It's also on the other side of it, how mechanically I often generate language. Hopefully not as a writer. I really hope not, but in everyday conversations. The thing called small talk. Meaningless, little, nice conversations with people on parties, on receptions, in the hallway, wherever. I feel like it has really changed my sense of how I create language internally. I talk to people and I think of an LLM, and I kind of can feel how my mind does the auto what's it called? Autocomplete thing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I mean that's what I mean. We do learn. It's not just how amazing are these things. It's also we learn we are kind of less amazing than we think we are. That's what technological progress always taught us in some way. Das ist die großen Beleidigungen, like as Freud called it. And we were always rejecting this, and I'm rejecting this too, of course, but I'm also trying to remain curious about it.
And, you know, as for consciousness, the issue is substrate independence always philosophically first, right? I mean, so here this might be a clear case where, you know, trivially information processing is substrate independent. And, this is information processing on any reading, whatever. What else, right? So if information processing is substrate independent, and if it is reasonable to think of this as understanding, and that strikes me as reasonable.
Yes.
On the contrary, I would find it unreasonable if I reacted to this by denying that this is understanding. So here, I think the phenomenological basis, is like too strong. So then we have learned, understanding is substrate independent. But for consciousness, the issue seems to be one where, we are certainly dealing with a biological phenomenon, or so it seems. I mean, at some point, we are dealing with a biological phenomenon, cells, right? So the question is there an essential relationship between cells and consciousness? And there, the case seems to be just more plausible. But I wonder how you think about this, because I know that you are much more fascinated than some people. I mean, philosophy is divided among those who think consciousness is substrate independent and those who don't. But, where do you stand?
Personally, I think I'm carefully standing more on the side of the panpsychists. I feel like there is something very very plausible to me with the idea that consciousness is a phenomenon all the way down. In some small, in some very small, basic, fundamental way. But I would not claim this as a thesis. I would just say it's a hypothesis that seems to make sense to me. And I mean, there was a great, not a funny interview that the great Stanislav Lem, one of the world's great science fiction authors, and also actually early theoreticians of all these questions gave. And someone asked him about consciousness, and he, that would be kind of really frowned upon today, but he pointed at his secretary and said, I'm not even sure she's conscious. And if you take off the slightly misogynist joke here, it is true we are not sure any other entity is conscious. So we will probably never really know about artificial entities. But again, it's if it will completely act like it is conscious, we probably have to treat it like a conscious entity. There is also, and you are much more of an expert about that, then we will also have an ethics question about that, actually. If those entities act like conscious beings in every respect, do we still have a right to say, oh, they probably are just mimicking it, so I can turn them off whenever I feel like it?
Well, the question is, what counts? I mean, among humans and our relationship to some other animals, we do have criteria for recognizing someone as conscious. But these criteria go out, we run out of their applicability, once we leave basically the realm of mammals, right? I mean,
and I still
so we have a mammal
who,
consciousness.
And I still meet people who tell me mammals are not conscious.
Yeah. Which is surprising. That someone could hold that view, right? So consciousness is whatever exactly is certainly more widespread than one would think if we restricted it to just like one class of animals. So I think that should be a given. But then also consciousness is not something that we currently know what it would even take to detect from the outside. So like that's the conceptual puzzle isn't solved. It's not not really an empirical question. It's like, we need to look harder, but there's a conceptual problem we haven't solved.
So that's why at this point it might not even be the most interesting questions about AI. At this point, probably what is understanding is the more interesting question, and then also probably the question, we will soon get there. We're not quite there yet, I think, but we might be there very soon. The question, what is creativity?
Yeah.
Are they actually creative or are they not creative? And that's I mean, that is tied to the question of consciousness, or we could get to the point where, like with understanding, we will have to say that creativity is not necessarily tied to consciousness, which is kind of an earth-shaking thought, but it might be true.
Recently, I mean, now, as you mentioned a little earlier, right? I mean, the more we deal with AI systems, use them for our work, the more it feels like the things that we do are like the things they do, right? I mean, your small talk example, or me feeling like I'm one of those podcast hosts, right? I mean, it's very hard for me not to feel like that, right? It also helps me to have less of a German accent if I try to speak like them. Normally in the past, I always just imagined John Searle is speaking, and then I was my most American self. But given that John Searle was kind of canceled, I can't be John Searle anymore. But now I can be one of those podcast hosts. Let me give you an example of how, something that happened to me the other day. I was discussing with a Buddhist monk. He came up here at several junctures, the techno-capitalist Buddhist monk, who thinks, Shokei Matsumoto is his name, that we ought to build an ethical AI that solves our ethical questions, right? So given that we ought to do what's morally right, and given that we don't know well enough what we ought to do, ethics is a very primitive science. The late Derek Parfit once said, secular ethics is, worse off than physics at the time of Copernicus, right? So it's in bad shape, scientifically speaking. But I've been arguing, and this is how I, met the monk, that AI systems, given that they're good at pattern detection, right, could in principle become ethical machines. So we could have like a version of the podcast which tells us something about the nature of understanding for ethics.
Which is a completely anti-Kantian position, it seems to me, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, but there's once more, I'm not a Kantian.
I know.
This is where, I'm open-minded about this, right? This made me open-minded about understanding. And then more recently I became, and it's more speculative territory because no one has tried to build that AI. And now Shokei Matsumoto, in addition to agreeing that one can build this, argues that we therefore ought to build it. And he imagines a future society, which he thinks is not dystopian, where we have a system, let's call it the good, or Alpha Buddha, or whatever, and the system constantly informs us what we ought to do morally, right? And then you do it, because, okay, if those are the moral facts, so imagine, we all do the good, right? And there's a broadcasting system that tells us what we ought to do. Like, what do you think about that possible scenario?
I guess I'm more of a Kantian than not, so I have to say that's not a terrible idea. It's actually a very good idea, but it's in my opinion an idea that completely leaves out the fact that an ethical decision has to be an autonomous decision, and that the categorical imperative, as actually Omri Böhm says in our book so beautifully, is not an algorithm, but it is an act of freedom. And so this machine would just replace God in Kant's idea that God has no ethical authority. And that's, I think, is one of the greatest ideas or greatest findings in all of Kant's work, that even if there is an all-powerful creator of the world, in ethical terms, just the fact that this entity orders us to do something does not make it good. Only the fact that we autonomously realize that it's good makes it good. So therefore, I can't agree with that. But on the other hand, again, like if you had talked a year ago, I would have disagreed about understanding too. So
that's why I think this might be a repetition.
We might be getting there.
I fully, I fully hear you on this, but this might be the uphill battle scenario, right? So because given that nobody has tried,
and it is actually, come to think of it, it is an even more important question than the question about art.
Yeah,
it's of course it is an interesting question whether this thing will ever make better books or paintings than us. But this, if that would be possible, that would be, that would actually be the most revolutionary thing in human history.
Yeah, I think so too. Let's,
so it solves the problem of how to act.
Yeah, I'm supporting the ethical AI movement most recently for that reason. I'm on, but one more application of this to understanding, right? I'm learning Japanese now. Unfortunately, we have some Japanese native speakers here who can, but it's very hard to figure out their responses to questions you ask them about their language. But let's see if we can get into a useful conversation. But here's something that happened to me, which was the equivalent of, feeling like becoming one of those systems. So two moments. One was, I was reading, and I get to the Japanese in a moment. I was reading ancient Greek poetry to a neighbor. So this kid comes to play with my daughter. She's 12. She's Greek, right? But of course not ancient Greek. And so I gave her, Bakhylides, which is one of the most difficult authors. He's more difficult than Pindar, actually. And I gave her a poem, right? And I said, "Can you read this?"
In
ancient Greek.
Yeah.
And so she read it, and it's like, it's strange, says the 12-year-old. It feels like Greek, but I don't understand anything, right? And then I looked at one of the verbs that was there, prepe, in ancient Greek. And I felt like I was thinking like AI, because I've been using DeepL much more for translation. So I felt in this moment like an AI system was operating in me. And I realized, and I asked her, and I got this right, that in contemporary Greek, you would say prepi, right, which is just a contemporary way of pronouncing the word, in a context where your grandmother orders you to do something. Right? You gotta eat up your meal, prepi. And I figured, I told her that this must mean that. So I anticipated a context of use for an ancient Greek word in a contemporary setting. And I was right. She goes, this is where I know the word from. And another example, and I think this is AI running my mind. This is not me being a creative reader of ancient Greek.
Do you mean you literally learned this from AI?
Yes, this way of thinking.
Yeah.
Look, trivially, so here's something I disagree about with Elon Musk. I think, if we go all out on the possibility of AI, then the idea that we would need a chip in our brain is a ridiculously 20th century idea. Because AI systems interfere with our neurons anyhow. Right? If you just listen to this, then your neurons, right? The AI plays your brain like a piano. Anyhow, this is why you get addicted to TikTok. And if this is the case, then we don't need a chip for us to be, in a symbiotic relationship with the entity. All it takes is having a brain. And I do think that indeed this case, and I give you a second one for Japanese in a moment, is AI using my brain for translation. And I think there are effects like this, right? Let's get to, I come to the Japanese example later, but here's something that you also worried about quite early when ChatGPT came out, right? I remember having this conversation with you about the threat to liberal democracy, right? And one of your biggest worries was precisely not, will there be novelists in the future, but rather, what does it do to democracy? So where do you stand on this?
Still my biggest worry.
Yeah?
Still hasn't changed, but yeah.
Yeah. So where do you stand on this? And then I give you the Japanese example and run it by the Japanese.
This is not a philosophical question. This is more like a political question, a question of practical use. But I'm convinced that one of the biggest markets, for lack of a better word, for AI products will be friends and romantic partners. That sounds weird, but that's actually how developers think about it. For people to surround themselves with virtual friends, and then also romantic partners, which is kind of just a version of it. It's a very close friend. So so you can have people in your life who know you very well, who go through life with you, people, quote unquote, and know you extremely well, and know what you like, and know what problems you had with your friends or relatives, because they read your emails. They have you. They are actually, they not read is the wrong word. They have your emails. They are part of them is your emails and your texts and everything you say. And now imagine those virtual friends. But this is still an old-fashioned way to think about it. Sponsored by Chinese companies, for example, or just by an algorithm that's similar to what we have on YouTube or all social media, which is a behavioral adaptive algorithm that just enhances your engagement. So that means those virtual friends are going to, because that's what the algorithm found out by itself, is that we enhance our engagement. We spend more time on YouTube when it proposes us things that make us angry. And that's one of the big reasons for political division and partisanship everywhere, as we all know. And now imagine this is not being some algorithm just proposing another YouTube video. This is a close friend who knows you and is telling you, isn't it terrible how Kamala Harris is laughing and stuff. And this is not a philosophical question at all. And I think it's even in philosophical terms kind of boring to think about that. But in political terms, it's where the European Union should really interfere, because the European Union is the last big entity that can do something about it, because the United States are not going to. But they just passed their first big piece of legislation about AI, which sounds great, but it's legislation that was all written before 2019.
Yeah.
So it's a joke. It's really a joke.
Yeah, absolutely. But like the ethical AI system could help us with that. So if we had the ethical, so one thing that we did a couple of years ago here, we had also people from Google. They were combating terrorism, and they are of course capable, obviously, like not to mention Palantir, but they are of course capable of detecting, distinguishing in large data sets between a real terrorist threat in a WhatsApp communication and just mere expressions of anger. So they were able already, this was in 21, to detect toxicity.
And apparently it works. That's how the Taylor Swift bomb or whatever threat it was in Vienna was detected.
Yeah, that's quite remarkable. So if we can do this, right, and then we can run, in principle, the ethical AI on online communication. And this would be a different type of content moderation. So, that would, of course, be compatible with liberal democracy and freedom of speech.
Yeah, but again, I feel like I'm strangely old-fashioned in my Kantianism. I think, in a way, you cannot have an ethical algorithm, because the moral decision is a decision made in autonomy. And it's the only way how real freedom enters the world. There is no freedom except if you make a decision if you make a real decision on an ethical question. So I feel even if that would work, and it might work, it might still be it might put everyone back into the world people in the Middle Ages lived in their, maybe not in reality, but in their idea and sense of what the world was like. You're in the world and there's an all-powerful God that knows what's right, and you just have to follow orders. And in a way, even if the AI is right, ethical behavior is not following orders. So there's a paradox in this.
Yes, absolutely. But like this paradox could maybe be overcome if the idea was, of course, not that the system judges for me. It's not like there's a conclusion and I just have to do what the conclusion says.
Yeah.
Right. This would violate this.
There was a big debate in the late 18th century, as you know. That's why they brought up this idea of der schönen Seele.
Yeah.
Die schöne Seele. And Goethe wrote die Bekenntnisse einer schönen Seele in Wilhelm Meister. Schöne Seele is the person who follows the categorical imperative, but not aus Pflicht, but aus Neigung. Not from duty, but because they want to.
Yeah. They like being good.
They just like being good. And then there was the big debate, but are they really good if they do it because they liked it? And I'm not so Kantian that I would say no, that's not true. But I mean, that would be an utopia that makes us all to schöne Seele in Goethe's sense. Except, of course, then if someone doesn't want to follow orders by the ethical AI, then what? Then we're actually with Rousseau, who says if you're against the Volksgeist, you have to be surgically removed from it.
Well,
so I don't like
immoral.
all that. I don't
but
like all
that would
that.
be immoral. I mean, ex hypothesis. So let's now imagine. Let's imagine that typically our resistance to this idea, right, of just following order. I think you stated some of the most important resistances we have to such a conception of society. But what if, right? I mean, the system, by definition, would solve that problem too, right? That's the very point. Yeah. I mean, the very point is that, of course, it wouldn't order us to follow the moral law because it's an order. That would be immoral. So the system would behaviorally manipulate us more like Google does, right? In the surveillance capitalism interpretation, which has its limit. But we do know that Google, right, is not only a sociologist. I've been arguing lately that Google is the best sociologist that ever existed. But it's not only a sociologist, it changes behavior. It doesn't just study behavior, it modifies behavior by being part of society. The restaurants we go to and so forth, right? Just human behavior is largely a manifestation of online behavior in non-online reality by now. And now imagine a scenario where this is the case. It's still human behavior, but what's manifested in non-online context is the good, right? I mean, would we still have an objection against this, or are we clinging to a straw here in exactly the same sense in which we want to say, well, they are writing, but it's not great literature. They are doing this, but it's not great, until it is.
I mean, if you really run this thought experiment, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but then you are, in a way, already halfway to transhumanism, because then the next question is, why would such a brilliant AI running all things even need to bother with us?
Yeah.
It could just run things and not bother with us. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's true, actually. Naturally, we don't like that thought. But it might be true.
Let's come back to the Japanese Buddhist. So there was this episode, I don't know if you saw this, there's Heidegger talking to a Buddhist monk on German TV.
It's weirdly funny.
It's weirdly funny, right? So Heidegger tells the Buddhist monk, look, in the West, or he says we distinguish between humans, animals, plants, and rocks, and you don't. Right? And the Buddhist monk it's unclear if he even understands what Heidegger's after when Heidegger tells him this, right? So they have this conversation, but it's certainly clear that there's no way in which they understand each other.
And we can also say at this point there was really not a lot of reliable literature on Buddhism available in German. So Heidegger gets his idea of what Buddhism is mostly from Hermann Hesse and Schopenhauer.
Yes, at best, exactly, And so the communication, uncannily fails. And then recently I was in a similar situation with a Buddhist monk in Tokyo in a temple, and it was straightforward, right? It was very easy. We could even make fun of the Heidegger video, right? And I just saw him here again, and then he also said, given that we are exposed to large-scale translation activity mediated by the internet and now accelerated by AI, we do in fact understand each other. So, so here's now my Japanese example. So Japanese aesthetics has all these very interesting terms, classifying things in different ways. And when we go to Japan, we are like, wow, this is very beautiful. And we realize that there's something aesthetic going on. And so like one of the big terms is mono no aware. And you know, like everybody's like, that's hard to understand. But I think AI, like dealing with AI, allows one to understand it. And now let's run it by the actual audience. So like there's this, you know this feeling when there's a transition of seasons, right? Fall is coming, the air is a little colder, you know, the leaves, and you know, you're looking forward to the next season, right? So, and it's like, great, the next season. But at the same time, of course, it's the end of summer. So whatever great happened in summer, it's over, it's gone. So at the same time, you know, things are gone, something is destroyed, death, finitude, but you're enjoying this in light of what's coming. And I think this is a case of mono no aware. Mono means things in a very interesting abstract sense. So if you take any Japanese verb, right, take out the ending and add mono to it, then you turn it into things. So taberu means to eat, tabemono are things to eat, right? Kao means to buy, and kaimono are things to buy, right? And so you can do this with everything. And now just take this ending mono, right? This is things in the abstract thing of sense of things. And aware is a kind of like sweet sadness. So the sweet sadness of things. And my thought now is we can generalize from this example of seasons to basically any scenario. So you had a good dinner with friends and you're on your way home. And then you might feel mono no aware in exactly the same sense in which you feel it at the transition of seasons. Is this correct? Is this mono no aware? Yeah. Good, thank you. And you know, like, but if you look at the literature about Japanese aesthetics, people will tell you, Westerners can never understand it. And other qualities like furio and so forth, right? There's always the story, impossible to translate, right? Japanese, impossible to translate. And I think it's very easy to translate, but it wasn't easy to translate. I'm just giving you this example that as someone who's been learning Japanese for 6 months, I have access to like the complicated Japanese vocabulary because of that. That's the claim. This might be, I'm claiming that our mind, human minds, are becoming way more intelligent due to artificial intelligence.
So do you mean you understand the term now because you translated it not the old way by learning vocabulary, but the new way, the way AI does it by using a data set in your head? Or
exactly.
So you don't mean you used AI, you mean like
exactly.
I didn't
use
analogy.
AI at all. I didn't use AI at all. I read an old book like by 2006 or something by an American who stayed in Japan after the war. He didn't want to go back to America. He wanted to have like a different experience. He would have been like somewhere in the flyover country and so forth. Right? He really just didn't want to be in America, so he stayed in Japan. And late in his life wrote about this vocabulary. And also this guy throughout the entire book claims you cannot understand these things, right? So he never, like, he's been there for 30 years and he only had a glimpse of mono no aware, he claims. And so let's trust him. Let's imagine that he wasn't dumb or anything. He was around and he couldn't get mono no aware, right? But I think that we can get mono no aware, and I think everybody understood mono no aware now, right? Because our brains are attuned to translation mechanisms. So I really think that the internet and our exposure to AI literally does the kinds of things that Elon Musk thinks Neuralink will be doing in the future, but it's already happening. So what do you think about this? It's kind of a literally speculative hypothesis.
I mean, it's kind of a more involved version of what I said about doing small talk.
Exactly.
I mean, at least I'm not sure. Maybe you're right. I'm not sure it means we're doing things in a new way, but we certainly learned something about how we do things. On the other hand, the argument has been made that whenever there's a technological progress, and so whenever there's some big technological progress, we compare ourselves to whatever came out of it. So in the 50s, everyone said the brain is like a computer, and because the computer was new, and now we feel like we are basically like AI. But that's kind of a too easy and too trivial way, because it is true that the computer taught us a lot about our brains, even though the brain is not working like a computer technically. And it is true that AI teaches us a lot about I wouldn't even say how we use language, how often language gets used through us without us using it. I think it was true every time, and it is true this time. And about translation, I mean, it's also amazing that we didn't have the whole conversation about understanding earlier when AI got so good at translating.
Right.
But somehow we all convinced ourselves that translating very well does not mean understanding. Now, looking back, there was a good deal of understanding there, apparently. I mean...
and basically the definition, like the most sophisticated definition of understanding that was developed in recent logics and semantics, by Quine and Davidson in America, actually was a whole research program, and it got a little forgotten when Davidson died, 15 or 20 years ago or something, but it was like very chic. But maybe they got this right, because they said understanding is translation. There's absolutely no difference between the issue of translatability and the issue of understanding. And in this way, they got around the idea which Wittgenstein, of course, and now we might say effectively criticized, namely the idea that understanding is some kind of special, bulb in the mind. This came up this morning as well, right? This idea that there's something in your mind, and that does the understanding when you understand something. Right?
Would you say, I mean, I feel like you're moving a little bit closer to Wittgenstein with every new project. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but would you say, and this is a thought I'm having for the first time, that somehow AI is kind of vindicating the idea of the Sprachspiel a little bit?
Yes, surprisingly, because Wittgenstein himself thought that his theory of language games would help him against AI. I mean, he was discussing this literally with Turing in Cambridge, and he thought that he had precisely grounded language then in the life form and so forth, and the natural history.
But the LLM revolution was literally not to teach the system grammar, not to teach them rules, but to just dump language.
Exactly. Yeah. And so Wittgenstein, remarkably, I think Wittgenstein got that wrong about Wittgenstein, like so often, right? So indeed, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, I also see this now for the first time, so thanks for bringing this out. I think indeed the philosophical investigations might be the philosophical theory of language that is most adequate for this, precisely because it is not about rule following. Right? I mean, so maybe AI is the solution to the Wittgensteinian rule-following problem, right? Which basically goes like this, right? If meaning is normative, we discussed this briefly, then, there's a rule for application of a word, there's a given context, how do you bring the given context under the application of the rule? Either there's another rule telling you how to do this, right? Or you follow the rule blindly, as he puts it. Or, and that is the alternative, nobody is following rules when we are speaking. So if it's pattern detection is different from grasping a rule, comparing a situation to the rule, recognizing that it's an application as a condition of the rule, and then applying the rule.
And I mean, this is important in very practical terms. Even the standard, I mean, the biggest objection to Wittgenstein, also my objection would be, what about math? And he always said math is a Sprachspiel, which mathematicians usually claim is ridiculous. But when you ask ChatGPT to solve a math problem, it still does it on statistical terms, which is kind of a big, if you talk to AI programmers, it's a big headache to them because it needs too much energy. Like, there's no, if you ask the AI to solve a very simple calculation, it cannot just take out a little calculator, type it in, and put in the answer. It uses the whole data set to generate a statistical answer. That's why it also gets math wrong often. So it solves math in a Wittgensteinian way. It doesn't even apply rules, and they're working on changing that, and they probably will, because they need to change it to save energy. But the last time, I mean, we have to be very careful. Maybe that changed in the last month or so. But the last time I heard AI experts talk about that, they said this is one of the big problems we have to solve to make it more efficient. So to make it less Wittgensteinian in regard to math.
Yeah. The question is, like now, and I know you also had a chance of talking with him somewhat regularly. But now that then Dennett died, I mean, you mentioned that one of the last things you heard him say was the pronouncement of a big warning.
Yes.
And maybe there's something right about the following Dennettian basic idea, right? The mutual ascription of mentalistic vocabulary, right? To mutually think of ourselves, as conscious and so forth, desiring things. The entire vocabulary of human civilization and literature, basically, through which we, carve out our mental states in social practices. All of this might just be, like a simplified form of what, at the end of the day, pattern recognition. It's just that we are not able to draw on the pattern recognition yet. But AI might change this. So what did Dennett? Why do you think Dennett worried that much?
He worried about the political. He did not worry about AI taking over the world and killing us all because transhumanism or something. He was really worried about what I talked about before, about political disinformation, algorithm based on a scale like nothing we've seen before. And I mean, I didn't know him well, but those of you who have an idea of what he was like, he didn't seem like someone who was easy to, who easily got very nervous. And he was very nervous about this. I would say he was in a panic. And everyone, it was a small group of people, and everyone was kind of a little bit politely dismissive. And that was about, I think, a year ago, and now I'm taking it much more serious than I did a year ago. On a philosophical basis, by the way, because we talked about consciousness before. I mean, Dennett always, in philosophy of mind, he had this very strange, kind of paradoxical idea that we are actually not conscious. We just think we are, which, as many people have pointed out, seems to be an obvious paradox. Like, if we think we are conscious, then we use the thing that we don't have to create the illusion that we have it. But again, with thinking of myself the way AI teaches me to think of myself, I at least can give to him that I am less conscious than I think I am. That even when I create language, again, hopefully not as a writer, but in everyday life, that I often do this on a much more automatic, automatized basis than I was aware of before I saw that AI could do or does exactly the same. Yeah. So I still don't quite buy Dennett's consciousness doesn't exist idea. I think there still remains a paradox that we will never get out of, or he will never, if you follow that idea. But he was very good at making points in his work that we are not as brilliantly present and conscious as we think we are most of the time during the day. Yeah. And I think this is a huge example that vindicates him, but he was not happy about it because he went straight for the political consequences. And I think sadly he was completely right about that. So I completely share his worry there.
Okay, so thanks for this part of the conversation, and now we can just open it up, open the floor to everybody who is here. Conversation with Daniel and me as the podcast host. I hope, you know, the voice and all of this, like I should stop listening to those kinds of things. It always feels like, yeah. Okay, good.
Just a really, really brief question about terminology, because I think we have many of the central notions already on the table, like the artificial understanding, meaning, and so forth. But we did not speak about the ontology of information so far. So could you say a bit more about what information is, since you already said it's substance independent, so to speak, and yeah, but we do not really grasp now, I think, what the ontology is of information.
Yeah, so like maybe a word about this. There, I feel like happily vindicated with my own ontology, so I can basically just give you like the official answer, which comes easy. But the idea is like, so if reality, so like one way of thinking about ontology, right, in respect to reality, right? So imagine ontology is about how things are, right? And not about how we commit to things being, right? So let's reject that idea that there's a layer between us and things when we do ontology. And so then, you know, how are things? Well, they are arranged in a certain way. It's not that reality is made up of points that just behave in a point-like way, right? Trace curves through reality. Because even the most minimal way of stating such a view, physics, requires for us to specify coordinate systems. So you cannot even think of points behaving in a way without coordinate systems. That means that for things to be arranged in any way, you have to have what I call a sense, a mode for them to be presented to each other and to thought when thought is present. And so like that part of things is information. It's the way in which they are arranged. So I'm not a pan-informationalist, so I don't think that, I don't think that fermions and bosons, tables and chairs, humans and skyscrapers are information. But I think they are constitutively embedded in information. So I think the concept of a fact is the concept of information. There's no gap between the concept of a fact, that is things being a certain way, and information. And what information processing gets us is that it understands that that facts in the physical universe are primarily encoded on the electromagnetic spectrum. So electrons and photons too, but electrons in particular are important for facts. So that's why quantum physics that's why it feels so fundamental, because it would then be a theory of the way in which senses or facts are structured. It would be an ontology rather than a mere physics. So that's basically how I think about this. And then information is, the idea is, of course, think of reality as answering questions, right? Is there a microphone? Yes. So there being a microphone here is an answer to a question. So the microphone being here and being that way is information. But it's not that the microphone is information. The microphone's a microphone. But the microphone being here in that particular way answers a question, a host of questions. And that dimension of the microphone is information. And it's impossible to think of objects without thinking of them as embedded in such a way. So information is just the glue of reality, the gluons, right? There are logical gluons, and that's information. And I think that's why, if this is correct, then it would be weird if there was something in reality that AI could not model. That would be the surprising bit, right? That how would reality, if it's fact and information-like, pose an obstacle to AI? The future AI, right? Now there are limits, right? Energy, chips, these are just important engineering limits, and we might never overcome them. But that would mean there's no ontological limit to AI. Yeah. So should I just? Oh yeah, lots of hands. So and I'll just
Yeah, this is a simple question, and I'm new to a lot of the AI stuff, but I was having lunch with someone who did some philosophy of language stuff in the 80s, which was cited, it apparently been important to AI. There was a paper called Stochastic Parrots that people were talking about, that this person influenced. And I was talking with him, I said, I'm at this conference about AI. And he said, and this is a question about the extent to which the system could be said to have understanding, or the extent to which we can ascribe these kinds of states to the systems. And he said, an AI system can't be ironic, right? Like, the capacity of what I'm saying right now, it's always possible, because I'm an intentional agent, right? That I could be, lying to you in some way. Maybe I didn't have lunch with you. You know what I'm saying? And so I'm just wondering about the absence of intention, in the sense that how you would respond to that in terms of possibly a limit to the extent to which we could claim that these systems are understanding and so forth. If that makes sense.
No, you first.
Yeah, sure, please. Well, I mean, the question is whether, the human practice of intention or human subjectivity, right, is of course absent from the AI systems, because they are not human subjects, right? So certainly something is absent. And the question is, what contribution does that which is not in the system make to the reality of language and understanding, right? And then it might be the case that the AI system can understand and model and do all the things it does for a gigantic amount of language, right? While still not being near, so while still in principle being isolated from these other parts. And then so imagine we told this to the engineers in California, then they could say, okay, cool, let's model that, right? So then the next step is these systems certainly don't have subjectivity. That is also the capacity of making a mistake. I think one shortcoming that the systems have is that they don't make mistakes.
I mean, you don't mean mistakes as mistakes, because they get a lot of stuff wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, but that's not making a mistake, right? So
because mistake is intentional.
No, we blame. So depending on what type of mistake people make or take lying, right? So if we think of lying, and if we think of lying as a maybe moral mistake, right? So intentionally saying the false, pretending that it's true, with the aim of winning resources over another. Right? That's, by the way, the solution to the Kantian lying problem, right? Lying is bad because of that, not because saying, claiming that a proposition which is false is true is not morally evil, but doing so in order to steal something is, right? So but that's just a footnote on Kant and lying. But yeah, so the idea is that, when we think that someone lied or enjoy their irony, then it is essentially about the features of humans' subjectivity that those systems lack. So they might malfunction. So if ChatGPT hallucinates, then OpenAI says this is malfunctioning. Like here, they're warning you, when you use this Google function, they warn you that the system sometimes gets things wrong. But what they're warning you about is not don't trust this guy, right? Or he's not as educated as he seems, or nobody is perfect. What they say is this sometimes malfunctions, right? Whereas we blame people when they do other things. So the question is whether the moral dimension of language and its whole intersubjective reality, right? Whether this is constitutive of language and can't be modeled. I mean, now AI researchers could start precisely then modeling that, of course. They would look at different things in language.
But I'm also not so sure about if we can actually that easily say there's no intention there. Yeah. I mean, you're the Schelling expert, but if we go with Schelling, then intention is the most basic fact in the world, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
then everything is intention. So they have the model has intention too. Intention is all there is.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, one thing indeed, I mean, just mentioning this earlier, you know, we talked about Schopenhauer briefly, but, you know, indeed, so one important thing that brings Schelling, Schopenhauer, Leibniz, and everybody who's not just a materialist, modern nihilist together, including the so-called indigenous peoples, right, is that basically everybody outside of like a very small community of modern people, self-identifying moderns, thinks that indeed intention is fundamental, right? Or as Schelling puts it, original being is will.
Yeah.
Right? This is where Schopenhauer gets it. He's just, you know, stealing from Schelling there. But the idea is that the Kantian thing in itself is will.
Or Leibniz, the appetitus, the monade, the monad that wants something. That's what makes the monad. It wants something. It wants to develop, actually. I don't know how we get to a Leibnizian interpretation of an LLM. That's maybe too far of a stretch because it's not a monad, but yeah, that's I think that's going too far. But that intention is everywhere is, as you say, that's a very basic idea of a big part of Western and actually not Western philosophy.
Yeah. It's not as outrageous as it seems when we just assume that a certain type of actually antiquated materialism is true, right? So antiquated materialism did not answer the question what matter is, and we now know what matter is. Matter is fermions and bosons, right? That's matter. And then there's dark matter, and we don't know what that is. Okay, fine, right? But that's not fermions and bosons. And it's a lot of it, right? But fermions and bosons, right, lend themselves to such an interpretation because of quantum mechanics. Like many of the phenomena, you know, there's objective chance there, and, so what we know about matter now, you know, is perfectly compatible with Leibnizian interpretations, actually.
Yeah. Which is amazing.
So, like, lots of hands. So, like, I try to, like, somehow distribute, but everybody will have a chance. So, but let's do a round. Then let's go. Yeah, you're next. Yeah. Let's just go around. And then that's some principle of fairness.
Hey, thank you. So I'm interested in what you say to the metaphor of this technology as a mirror, because you... that's what you also said yesterday. You showed us how first the technology tries to mirror human behavior or like human podcasts or whatever, but then it also functions as like a reflection to for us and ask ourselves, who are we, and am I even conscious, or am I secretary or whatever? But somehow I think this metaphor has also some limits, because a mirror only does some representational work, but you also pointed out that, for example, Google influence our behavior, and in which way do you think this metaphor is correct, and in which other ways do you think we need other metaphors or ways of speaking and thinking about, maybe to both of you?
Maybe I start. So I think, like, coming back to Stanislav Lem, I think instead of a mirror, we should think of Solaris, right? So there's something mirror-like about Solaris, but it's also not just a mirror, right? So, like, in any interpretation of Solaris, there's some projection mechanism going on, right? But in addition to the projection mechanism, right, these entities, these phantoms that appear on the station are real. Right, and I think AI. I think the ontology of it, the structure of reflection, is like the Solaris structure. I think that comes closest to how I think of the way in which the systems then manipulate us.
And then also and what's also true is in Solaris, the big mystery that remains is that there is not just, do we not know, like the characters, do they not know whether that ocean is conscious?
Exactly.
They don't know how they would ever find out.
Yeah.
So it's and they would really, and you as the reader really want to know, but not just it's not just that the information is withheld, it's also you understand that there is no way they will ever find out whether an entity that's different from them, so far different, can be called conscious or not.
Yes, absolutely. So let me add one dimension. So here's something that just came to my mind for the first time. I've been defending the view that thinking is a sense modality. So information processing, grasping how things are, facts, in terms of thinking, is just more senses. And then, you know, the first objection that people have to this is, okay, what are the proper objects of thinking? The proper objects of seeing are colors and shapes and corners, right? And the proper objects of hearing are sounds and blah, right? And this is how and what are the proper objects of thinking? Well, there I would say information. But if information is encoded paradigmatically in the electromagnetic spectrum, then what if thinking as a sense modality was being in touch mentally, right? But still in touch, as literally as anything can be in touch, right? A concept is a grasping, after all, right? With a particular, layer of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, the interesting thing about AI and the internet and the infosphere, just literal infosphere on planet Earth, is that this ocean, this invisible ocean, though it is everything visible is part of that ocean, right? The visible is just part of that spectrum, read out by neurons such as ours. If we now have like travelers in this ocean, AI systems, right, that are broadcast through us by the internet, then it wouldn't be surprising that this change in the electromagnetic infrastructure of thinking changes our thinking. Right? It's like the ocean has changed. Before there was the internet and now AI, which changes the currents in the ocean, right? We were just thinking. And there was no other, like, apart from like maybe angels, gods, and other animal spirits, right? But no human artifact was doing the thinking. And now suddenly there seem to be travelers in this ocean. I think this is not an entirely crazy thought.
It's fascinating. It's not crazy. No, it's strange but uncrazy.
Yeah, and I'm specifying this because this is basically just stating facts, right? All of this is true, with the additional philosophical idea, based on my own ontology, that we can think of facts as information encoders, right? If some naturalistic version of the ontology of fields of sense has to be true for the universe anyhow. Right? I'm not an idealist in the sense of someone who believes that the facts are elsewhere, right? The facts are also here. The actual table is embedded in a fact. It's not that there's a table and then there's a mental fact somewhere in a mental realm and we don't know how to connect the two. The table is in the fact. In fact, there are tables, like in a local sense of in. And this would be very much like Solaris, right?
Yes.
With the but we kind of triggered the ripple in the waves, right? I mean, we started it.
So thank you very much for the inspiring talk. It seems to me that you two are agreeing that broadcasting God AI is not really good because of a lack of autonomy or freedom. And I just wonder why these autonomy or freedom are valuable, even if the ultimate morality could be achieved. War is not happening, there is no poverty, no climate change. So where does this intuition that autonomy and freedom are still valuable comes from? Is it this because of our non-instrumental desire for freedom, or more than that? And if it's desire, then it could be does it could be object of morality in itself? So this is my question.
Yeah, that's a great one, please, because you started commitment to freedom. I think this is a really great
That is
question.
a great question, and I think what it comes down to is a value judgment, but because, and I think we can agree on that, if there is no autonomous decision, then there is no freedom. And if there is no freedom, then there is actually, would Kant say, and I think I agree with that, then then the question of ethics is actually not a real question. Then it is, as some of the positivists would have said, it's a pseudo question. Then there is no behavior that we can, on any basis, call good behavior or wrong behavior. And I think we cannot fully maybe I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong here, but I think that we cannot fully exclude the importance of intuition from that, because there is logically nothing wrong with a world that has no moral dimension. It's the same way as logically nothing is wrong with a benevolent dictatorship. There's nothing logically wrong with that, but we have a strong intuition that a world in which there is no freedom is not the best of all possible worlds, so to speak, and we have, and that's something that Kant also points out. It is possible that actually the world where there is no freedom is the world we live in. It is possible that we always actually make decision on some strong, hidden, egotistical motives. But we do recognize something in the world, says Kant, where we feel like it would be better if it were different. We see phenomena, we see things in the world, we see things happening, and we feel like it shouldn't be, it would be better if it were not like that. But I think, I mean, you are asking, can we fully exclude our strong moral intuition from that? And I would say we probably cannot, but maybe I'm wrong about that. I would like to be wrong about that.
I mean, the big question that I think humanity is facing right now, like typically for like a while, that's something that's shifting in me, like when we go into those thought experiments. For a while, you know, certainly there's a risk to freedom, right, as autonomy. That's at risk right now, globally. And one way in which we all look at it is in terms of a threat to liberal democracy. And that's true, there's a threat to liberal democracy, right? I'm not denying the most obvious one. And then we draw a contrast between the authoritarian and the democratic and all these political contrasts that play an important role right now in heavy-duty geopolitical conflicts. I mean, rockets are shot by people at each other, you know, because of this discussion. I mean, that's not a mere thought experiment. It's actually that people are shooting rockets at each other. One's trying to get rid of freedom in that sense, and the other's trying to hold on to it. And then from that perspective, I side with the liberal immediately, right? That doesn't cost me anything, right? If I have the choice, if those are my options, right? The authoritarian or the liberal, I side with the liberal. And that's where the value judgment comes in. But there's one option that we all tend to forget. That's why this ethical AI thing strikes me as such an important thought experiment. What if, right, what's broadcasted was the good? And now we don't have a dictatorship problem because we have a system that, you know, like just detects the relevant patterns. And we have to admit that it does detect the patterns.
But it wouldn't be an ethical good. It would just be a utilitarian good. It would just be the best possible life for everybody. It would not, because if it would be the ethical good, then you would insert an ethical dimension, and that would actually require freedom. So it would just be a utilitarian, best possible life for everyone machine.
Yes, but there's one more dimension. So there's one more step in the argument that help even the Kantian to make that transition, namely the Kantian notion of the highest good. Kant has this additional notion which tries to reconcile noumenal freedom, right, ethics, and empirical reality, happiness, preference satisfaction. And that's the notion of the highest good. And the highest good would be one where we do the morally right thing and we get the utilitarian outcome, right? So we do the morally right thing and cancer disappears, right? We do the morally right thing and we are all wealthy. Kant says that's a great world.
But if there is no freedom and autonomy, then there is no morally right thing. Then there is just cancer disappears, which is great. But then there would be the reason why that would be good is just because that's a better, and even better is a problematic word here. That's a less painful life for the maximum amount of people, which is of course desirable.
Sure.
But there would be a world that has no ethical dimension, and perhaps Nietzsche is right, and the whole ethical dimension thing is an illusion, and the world we live in is actually that world where they're just facts. But that's a question.
Yeah, but like I, other than Kant, believe that there are moral facts. So if there are moral facts in that tapestry, woven into the tapestry of facts, not into the physical universe, but into the facts, and if we have systems that detect them, and if the moral facts happen to have a utilitarian dimension, I'm not a utilitarian. I think that's a confusion. But what if the moral facts, as a collateral, not damage, but as a collateral outcome, right, also generate wealth, right? So and Kant plays with this thought, right? That's him reading Adam Smith. Then the AI, could be detecting that pattern. Plus one more dimension, right? Of course, the ethical AI system that we're imagining does not force us to do anything, right? This would violate. Then it would just be the eclipse of ethics indeed. It might still be a holy world, the Kantian holy will, right? But it would be an unfree world. But what if what the system does indeed is some kind of incredibly sophisticated nudging? Like a nudging to which no one could object if we even understood it, but we don't even understand how it does it, right? So
well, where freedom comes in is we could always object.
We could say no to that.
We can always say no to that, and then you would again have the ethical decision by do I say yes or do I say no to the machine. So then that's pretty much the situation the Kantian person is facing towards God. So so I can live with that.
Yeah, indeed. It would would be a techno God, right? But one in reach. I think this is much more in reach than the singularity or AGI. We might need AGI for this.
It's at least conceivable that can actually be constructed.
Yeah,
yes.
I think so too.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, who was next in that row? Yeah, I'm just going that way.
Hello. Hi. So at the very beginning, you ventriloquized the sort of strong skeptical position, like to say, I don't understand anything, it's just a simulacrum, later to dismiss it. So I just thought I'd get you to say a little bit more, maybe try to defend it a little bit by doubling down on David's Kantianism and the need for autonomy.
Yeah.
So the strong view is that like either life and mortality, sort of the autopoiesis people, or caring, a sort of existential commitment to autonomous action, are necessary for, let's say in the first instance, ethical action. So for Kant, as David pointed out, like an action only has moral worth if it's made autonomously. And Kant distinguishes that from an action made from inclination or just mere incentives. As Kierkegaard says, just something working on me or in me. These things would be contingent, they're my circumstances, I just happen to be triggered to act in a certain way. So the strong claim then is that this is also a condition not just of moral action or an action having moral worth, but the condition of being an agent, period. Your example, either for AI or for us, so your example of the ethical AI that gives all the orders, well, you could just push the thought experiment a bit further and say, like, well, the AI could just like remotely control us to do the right thing with radio waves, just sort of get rid of the middleman. And in that case, it's really clear, A, that your action has no moral worth, but B, you didn't act at all, in a certain sense.
And I guess, I mean, at this point I kind of fall apart, but there's this sort of further steps in the argument where, okay, to recover that notion of agency and caring, you have to be in a condition of sort of finitude. You know, you could catastrophically fail by dying, and therefore you need to metabolize the environment to keep yourself going. This keeping yourself going is a sort of end in itself that's always there, a final cause of all your actions. It's the goal you're always meeting by performing those actions. And without that, you don't have the genuinely agential distinction between better and worse, and you're not really making distinctions of categories or understanding anything. Mm-hmm. So, you know, just maybe you could say a little more about like what's wrong with the argument. It just fails in the face of the overwhelming evidence of the Turing test. You know, how are you looking at it?
I think there was addressed to you, but I would add one more thing. I think there was quite a beautiful Kantian argument in a way. I would also add one more thing that just came to mind, that idea of an ethical AI that could actively really solve ethical problems, so that every single problem, every single question has a clear answer. I know that you say in your book on ethics that there cannot be a true ethical dilemma.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's kind of what you
And
take for
Kant
granted
agrees.
there.
Yeah.
I'm not, as a novelist, I have to say I'm still not 100% sure about that.
Yeah.
So I can still see that there are lots of questions in life where there are ethical dilemmas, where it's actually, even for a maximum wisdom entity, there's not one clear answer, and all the other answers are wrong. But that's just a thought. That's just a small caveat. But I can see you need that as a given before you can even conceive of an ethical AI.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Some assumptions go into this of the nature of practical reasoning, right? So, but you know, like here's another dimension of Schelling where he sets us apart, and in a way, Schelling thinks that the modern idea of freedom, thus understood, right, as drawing a distinction through a value judgment between us receiving orders, and be it from the good, right, and us having a good will in the first place. The only good thing that is deserved to be called good is a good will, says Kant, right? So like the will, right, that distinction, says Schelling against Fichte, is evil. Schelling has the interesting view that the idea that freedom could be prior to evaluation in terms of good and evil, right? So that, it's about the will and not about good and evil, he thinks that this is deeply incoherent, because the good will is good only if it's the good will. And it can't be about the will. It's not the will that makes the will the good will, because there's the good and the bad will. So it's not the will that wills itself into goodness. But of course, like from Kant to existentialism, the thought is precisely, that's Sartre is always this source, but then I think all literature is significantly about that dimension of ethics as dilemmatic. Mm-hmm. Sartre's example is the student who faces the choice between revenging his brother who was killed by the Germans in Second World War, right? But then he has to leave the mother. She's sick, and she just lost a son, and she might lose another son. What should he do? Fight the Germans or stay with the mother, right? And that's still like a simple example. And then, think of Gauguin and Anna Karenina and whatever. And then we might say the history of literature is one revealing a freedom to us where we thought there wasn't any, mm-hmm. right? So making a dilemma explicit is a progress in freedom. One can make all sorts of existentialist arguments in favor of this, right? But then the problem is that under those conditions, we do get into problem with practical reason, right? Then decision making would not be at all like reasoning oneself into the right view, but it would be making something the case, right? So Anna Karenina made it the case that divorcing isn't bad, right? So before it was neither good nor bad, like divorce just was a different thing, and then Anna Karenina does something, and now divorce changes its nature. That would be the view, the existential view, but it also comes at a cost, because then we can say that earlier practices were evil. They right? I mean, through an act of self-determination, we make it the case that slavery is bad, but then we can't say it was bad all along. But if we are able to say something like it was bad all along, rape was always bad, it's just that we are better at detecting, shades of sexual violence now, right? Not just the concept of rape, like the rape laws have gotten slightly better because we now know that rape is not that thing. We know there's a broader concept of it. And so we just get better at detecting these things, would be my reading. On the existentialist reading, one could say, oh no, we just changed the law.
Also on the Hegelian reading.
Yeah.
Like Hegelian reading is kind of
between.
both.
It's both.
Because
Hegel wants both.
it is, there are definitely ethical truths, but they are not true before the humanity gets there dialectically.
Exactly.
So in a way, slavery is wrong now, and it was wrong then, but for us.
Yes, that's the Hegelian solution.
Would be the Hegelian view,
that's the Hegelian solution. But but then the other one is still there, right? It was bad all along. So like when we take a time machine, and I mean slavery unfortunately still exists, so we don't have to take a time machine. We can just walk to whatever, the Lower East Side probably, right? But be that as it may, like slavery in its legal shape and so forth is largely gone. So if we took a time machine and we met like Abe Lincoln and so forth, right? Wouldn't we want to say, oh, look, guys, this is wrong? And then we wouldn't say for us, right? The for us qualification enters the picture once we historicize things. But if I took the time machine, I would object to this. Aristotle is like, oh, no, slavery is fine. We need talking tools in order to do philosophy. They're cleaning the house, and so it's great. We need that. Otherwise, we can't do philosophy here.
I'm wondering, is this the right interpretation of Hegel? Because Hegel does not say it wasn't true that everyone is free. He says even Aristotle did not know it. He said no one knew it. Even Aristotle did not know it. So I think he would say it was always true, but no one knew, and we had to find out.
Yeah, and of course he thought that Aristotle didn't have access to this, but this is just a small footnote on one thing that Omri says about Kant's racism. I think Kant was a full-blown racist. Yeah. I also think that Kant was not a universalist of any kind. I think
that's interesting.
I think that when Kant says humans, he doesn't mean at all what we mean by humans. When we say humans, we mean all humans, right? I mean, the thought, it would be very hard for me, fortunately, right, to think of like, oh yeah, all humans are blah, 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 right? And then you show me like a black woman, and it's like, but that's not a human. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, I don't know what it would take for me to think all humans being confronted with a black human say, but that's not a human. Fortunately, I don't even know what this would be like. For Kant, this was very easy, right? This was straightforward. And I think this is what makes him like an all-out racist. Because the category of human for Kant is already a restricted category.
I mean, not to defend him, but I think he wouldn't have said that. He kind of implied it, but if you had asked him about it, he would have kind of started to think about it and maybe told you, no, of course that's a human. So I think, but that's more of a psychological than a philosophical question.
It is really a psychological
I think it is something that he lived with contradictions there because no one exposed them.
Yes,
not to defend that, but it's psychologically a difference. But if you had asked him, I think he would have agreed with you.
But Maria von Herbert did. So the interesting thing is, like, if you look at some of the letters, like if you look at Kant, the person in his time, then the argument that 200 years ago it was just very natural to be a racist doesn't apply.
No, it wasn't. No,
right?
no.
Because indeed many people pointed this out to the actual Kant, right? People went there and said, you know, what you said in your anthropology lecture, sir, is not correct, right? But interestingly, he rejected that, you know, like...
But I mean, again, I'm really not his lawyer, and I don't want to be his lawyer about that. But at that point, even when he did the anthropology lecture, he was very old. I mean, again, I'm not defending him. I'm just saying because it's psychologically so interesting that someone like Kant, who was all about universalism, could be so limited. And so it's a psychologically interesting question to ask what mechanisms were that. And in that sense, it's interesting to say he was very old.
Yeah.
Not in the sense that it excuses anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, good. So we need to speed up Jan's things.
In the interest of time, I would say we collect all remaining questions and comments,
okay,
and
but
then
we
have
still
you
answer
reply
all
to
of them.
this.
Okay, but it forces us to more discipline. So the Alpha Buddha said, let's collect the questions. Okay. Let's do the good. We follow the order of the good.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a question a bit more concrete than the previous ones. Last February, one Japanese novelist won the Akutagawa Prize, which is one of the most prestigious literature prize in Japan. After the winning, she confessed that she used generative AI when writing the novel. This became a rather big news in Japan at the time. According to her, she used AI only in at maximum 5% or so of the novel, or whole novel. And those parts were the answers of AI on which a character in the novel asks a question. One of the problems this method might raise is about the copyright, of course, I suppose, but apart from that, how do you think about these examples of the partial use of AI when writing a novel from the literary or philosophical perspective?
I don't see a great problem there, because a novel was always